I bought a Ford Maverick hybrid to find out if the fuel economy numbers Ford advertises hold up in the real world. I tracked every fill up for 100,000 miles, every gas receipt, every oil change, every brake job. I wanted a real answer, not a dealership pitch. When I calculated the total fuel savings against a standard gas truck, the number was so much higher than expected that I ran the math 3 times to believe it. Today, I am breaking down what 100,000 miles in a Maverick hybrid actually costs, and the number that shocked me most. Let us start with what is actually under the hood, because most people buying this truck do not fully understand what they are getting. The Maverick Hybrid uses a 2.5-liter Atkinson cycle 4-cylinder engine paired with an electric motor and a small nickel metal hydride battery pack, all working through an electronic, continuously variable transmission. This is the same basic hybrid architecture Ford and Toyota have used for years in vehicles like the Escape Hybrid and the Corolla Hybrid, just reworked to fit inside a compact pickup. It is front-wheel drive only. There is no all-wheel drive option with the hybrid powertrain, and that surprises a lot of shoppers who assume every truck needs to send power to all 4 wheels. The battery itself is tiny compared to what you would find in a plug-in hybrid or an electric vehicle, just over 1 kilowatt hour, and it lives under the rear seat rather than eating into the bed or trunk space. You never plug this truck in. The gas engine and regenerative braking keep the battery topped off automatically, so from a driver's perspective, it behaves almost exactly like a normal automatic transmission truck. You just get in, put it in drive, and go. The Atkinson cycle itself is worth understanding because it's the real secret behind why this engine sips fuel the way it does. In a standard Otto cycle engine, the one running in almost every conventional gas vehicle, the intake valve closes early in the piston stroke, which maximizes power output but sacrifices some thermal efficiency. An Atkinson cycle engine holds the intake valve open longer, which lets some of the air and fuel mixture push back out before compression begins. This sounds like it would hurt performance, and it does reduce raw horsepower and torque compared to a similarly sized Otto cycle engine. But it dramatically improves thermal efficiency, meaning more of the energy in each drop of gasoline actually gets converted into forward motion instead of wasted heat. The trade-off works beautifully in a hybrid application because the electric motor fills in the torque the gas engine gives up, especially off the line and during acceleration, while the gas engine focuses purely on cruising efficiently once you're up to speed. It's a genuinely elegant piece of engineering, and it's the same basic formula Toyota pioneered decades ago and Ford licensed and refined for its own hybrid lineup. Ford's official EPA estimates for the hybrid Maverick land around 40 miles per gallon in the city and 33 on the highway, averaging out to roughly 37 combined. That's an unusual spread if you're used to normal vehicles where highway mileage is typically higher than city mileage. It's actually the opposite for hybrids because the electric motor and regenerative braking do their best work at low speeds and during stop-and-go traffic, exactly the conditions that murder fuel economy in a normal gas engine. On the highway, the gas engine has to run continuously to maintain speed, so the hybrid system helps less, and the mileage drops closer to what a small, efficient 4-cylinder would get on its own. This matters a lot for anyone deciding whether the hybrid is worth it for their specific driving situation. Because if you're doing mostly highway commuting, the gap between the hybrid and the standard EcoBoost engine shrinks significantly. Day to day, the way this hybrid system behaves is different enough from a normal truck that it deserves its own explanation before we get into the money. At a stoplight, the gas engine frequently shuts off completely, and the truck sits there in near silence, running purely on electric power for the accessories. Release the brake and give it gas, and the electric motor provides the initial push while the gas engine spins back up almost instantaneously, so there is no perceptible lag the way you might expect. Under light acceleration and at low speeds, the truck can run on electric power alone for short stretches, particularly coasting up to a stop sign or creeping through a parking lot. Under harder acceleration, both the gas engine and electric motor work together, and the ECVT keeps the engine spinning at whatever RPM produce the most efficient power for the demand you are placing on it, rather than shifting through fixed gear ratios like a conventional transmission. This is part of why some new owners describe the engine note as odd at first. Sometimes the RPMs seem disconnected from your actual road speed, because the transmission is prioritizing efficiency over the traditional feel of gears climbing in sequence. It takes a few weeks to stop noticing it, and after that, it just feels normal. Now here's where things get interesting, because I did not just want to know what the window sticker said. I wanted to know what actually happened over 100,000 real miles of driving, including winter cold starts, summer road trips with the air conditioning blasting, city errands, and highway hauls. I logged every fill-up in a spreadsheet from day one. My driving mix ended up being roughly 60% city and suburban stop and go and 40% highway. Over the full 100,000 miles, my actual average came out to 38.6 miles per gallon, which is slightly better than the EPA combined estimate. That does not happen with most vehicles. Usually, real-world mileage lands below the sticker number once you account for air conditioning, imperfect tire pressure, and aggressive drivers. The fact that this truck beat its own EPA rating tells you something about how conservatively Ford estimated it, or how well the hybrid system adapts to real driving patterns once the engine and battery are both broken in. To figure out the actual savings, I needed a fair comparison. I looked at the standard Maverick with the 2.0-liter EcoBoost engine and all-wheel drive, which is what most non-hybrid buyers actually choose. That configuration is EPA rated around 23 miles per gallon combined, and real-world numbers from owner forums and fuel tracking apps tend to land somewhere between 21 and 24 depending on driving habits. I use 23 as my comparison baseline since it's right in the middle of what actual EcoBoost owners report. Over 100,000 miles, my hybrid burned approximately 2,590 gallons of gasoline based on my logged 38.6 miles per gallon average. A comparable EcoBoost truck averaging 23 miles per gallon over the same 100,000 miles would burn approximately 4,348 gallons. That's a difference of 1,758 gallons of gasoline. Now let's talk dollars, because gallons alone don't tell the full story. Gas prices fluctuated wildly during my ownership period, ranging from around $2.90 a gallon up to briefly touching $4.80 a gallon during a regional price spike. I used my actual logged fuel costs rather than a flat estimate, and my total fuel spend across 100,000 miles came out to $9,847. When I ran the same 100,000 miles through the EcoBoost comparison using the same price data pulled from my logs, the total came out to $16,532. That's a difference of $6,685 in fuel costs alone over the life of the truck. That's the number that shocked me. I expected savings, sure, that's the whole point of buying a hybrid, but I expected something in the range of $2,000 or $3,000, not nearly $7,000. When you're talking about a hybrid option that historically cost Ford owners either nothing extra or only a modest premium over the gas engine, that kind of fuel savings completely changes the math on which powertrain actually makes financial sense. But fuel isn't the only cost that changes with a hybrid, and this is where a lot of reviews stop short. Maintenance costs shift dramatically too, and mostly in the owner's favor. Regenerative braking means the electric motor handles a huge portion of everyday slowing down, especially in city driving, which takes an enormous amount of wear off the physical brake pads and rotors. On my truck, the front brake pads lasted all the way to 94,000 miles before needing replacement. On a standard gas-powered Maverick doing similar city driving, you would typically expect to replace front pads somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 miles. That's not a small difference. Brake jobs aren't hugely expensive on their own. maybe $150 to $300 for a front pad and rotor service, depending on where you get it done. But multiply that out over 100,000 miles, and the hybrid easily saved one, possibly two full brake services. Oil changes were another area where the hybrid behaved differently than I expected. Because the gas engine shuts off frequently at stops and during low-speed electric-only operation, the engine actually accumulates fewer total running hours relative to miles driven compared to a conventional engine that's always running. Ford's recommended interval on the hybrid is still around 10,000 miles with full synthetic oil, same as the standard EcoBoost. But I noticed the oil consistently looked cleaner at each change interval, likely because the Atkinson cycle engine runs at lower stress levels most of the time and isn't constantly cycling through boost pressure the way a turbocharged EcoBoost does. Over 100,000 miles, I had exactly 10 oil changes at roughly $60 to $80 each, depending on whether I did it myself or paid a shop, putting total oil maintenance right around $700, which is essentially identical to what an EcoBoost owner would spend. Spark plugs were another maintenance item I expected to need earlier than I did. Ford specs Iridium spark plugs on the hybrid engine, which are designed for extended service intervals, and mine went the full 100,000 miles without a single misfire code or noticeable rough idle. Iridium tips resist erosion far better than the copper or platinum plugs used in older engines. And combined with the lower stress operation of the Atkinson cycle design, there was simply less wear happening at the electrode with every combustion cycle. I did have the plugs inspected at 90,000 miles out of curiosity, and the technician told me they still had usable life left, though I replaced them anyway as cheap insurance heading into the truck's second 100,000 miles. The 12-volt accessory battery, which is separate from the larger hybrid battery pack and handles things like the radio, lights, and initial power-up of the truck's computer systems, did need one replacement around the 71,000 mile mark. This is a completely normal wear item on any vehicle regardless of powertrain, hybrid, or otherwise, and cost about $180 including installation. It's worth mentioning only because some shoppers confuse this small 12-volt battery with the large hybrid battery pack under the rear seat and assume a battery warning light means an expensive hybrid system failure. In reality, it almost always means this much smaller and far cheaper component simply reached the end of its normal service life, just like it would in any gas-powered vehicle. The transmission is where I had the most questions going in because the electronic CVT used in Ford's hybrid system has a different failure history than a traditional automatic. Toyota and Ford have both been using variations of this power split hybrid transmission design for well over a decade at this point, and the track record is genuinely strong. There's no torque converter to wear out, no clutch packs slipping under load the way you'd find in a conventional automatic, and no dedicated CVT belt or pulley system like you'd find in a typical continuously variable transmission from other manufacturers, which is honestly the design that's earned CVTs their bad reputation over the years. Mine never needed any transmission service beyond the standard fluid check at scheduled maintenance visits, and it never exhibited the shuddering or hesitation that plagues traditional automatics as they age. The hybrid battery itself is the component every skeptical shopper asks about, and it's a fair question. At 100,000 miles, I had the battery health checked by a Ford technician using their diagnostic scan tool, and it showed no measurable degradation in charge capacity compared to factory specifications. This isn't entirely surprising once you understand how these systems are designed. The battery in a standard hybrid like this one is never charged to 100% or discharged to zero. The computer keeps it operating within a narrow window, typically somewhere between 40% and 80% of total capacity, specifically to preserve long-term battery health. This is completely different from how you'd treat a phone or laptop battery, and it's a big part of why hybrid batteries in vehicles like the Prius have documented cases lasting 200,000 to 300,000 miles or more without replacement. Ford backs the hybrid battery with a 10-year, 150,000-mile warranty in most states due to federal emissions requirements, which tells you how confident they are in the component's longevity. Tires ended up being one of the few areas where the hybrid didn't have an advantage and actually came out slightly behind. The extra weight of the battery pack and electric motor components adds a few hundred pounds compared to the standard gas engine configuration. That additional weight, combined with the low rolling resistance tires Ford specs from the factory to maximize fuel economy, meant my tires wore slightly faster than I expected, needing replacement at 52,000 miles instead of the 60,000 to 65,000 miles I typically get out of similar tires on other vehicles. Low rolling resistance tires are engineered with harder rubber compounds specifically to reduce friction and improve mileage, which is fantastic for fuel economy, but does trade off some tread life and, in my experience, slightly reduced wet weather grip compared to a standard all-season tire. This is a real trade-off worth knowing about before you buy, because it's rarely mentioned in reviews focused purely on the miles per gallon numbers. Towing capacity is a real limitation worth addressing directly, because plenty of truck shoppers assume any Maverick can tow whatever they need. The hybrid model is rated for up to 2,000 pounds of towing capacity, which covers a small utility trailer, a couple of jet skis, or a light landscaping trailer, but it's well short of the 4,000 pounds rating available on the EcoBoost model equipped with the factory tow package. This comes down to a combination of the electric motor's torque characteristics and cooling considerations for the hybrid components under sustained heavy load. If regular towing beyond 2,000 pounds is part of your life, the hybrid simply isn't built for that job, and no amount of fuel savings changes that math. I towed a small utility trailer loaded with mulch and yard waste a handful of times over the 100,000 miles, always well under the rated limit, and fuel economy predictably dropped into the high 20s during those trips, which is still respectable, but a reminder that hybrid efficiency numbers assume you're using the truck the way it's designed to be used. Something else worth mentioning that isn't strictly a cost but affects the ownership experience: cold weather performance. In freezing temperatures, hybrid systems generally see reduced fuel economy benefits because the gas engine needs to run more often to generate cabin heat and keep the battery within its optimal temperature range for efficient operation. During the coldest stretch of my ownership, several weeks with morning temperatures well below freezing, my average mileage dropped to around 32 miles per gallon, still respectable but a noticeable drop from my typical high 30s. This lines up with what hybrid owners across colder climates consistently report, and it's worth factoring in if you live somewhere with real winters, rather than assuming you'll hit that EPA combined number year-round. Resale value is the last piece of this puzzle, and it is directly tied to everything we have covered so far. Because hybrid Mavericks have built a strong reputation for reliability and fuel savings, they have consistently held their value better on the used market compared to equivalent EcoBoost trucks with similar mileage. When I checked comparable used listings around the 100,000 mile mark, hybrid trucks in good condition were commanding roughly $1,500 to $2,500, more than similarly equipped EcoBoost trucks with the same mileage and condition. That is not a massive number on its own, but stack it on top of the fuel savings and reduced brake wear, and the total cost of ownership gap becomes even wider than the fuel numbers alone suggest. So let us add it all up. Fuel savings over 100,000 miles came to $6,685. Reduced brake service saved somewhere in the range of $150 to $450, depending on how many services the comparison truck would have needed. Oil changes were roughly a wash. Tires cost slightly more on the hybrid side, maybe $100 to $150 extra over the same mileage. And the hybrid held somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500 more value at resale. When you total the realistic range across every one of these categories, the Maverick Hybrid came out somewhere between $8,000 and $9,500 ahead of an equivalent gas-powered truck over 100,000 miles. That is not a marginal difference. That is enough money to cover a year of car payments or a serious emergency fund cushion, all just from choosing the hybrid powertrain and driving the truck the way most people actually drive their daily vehicle. If there is one thing I would tell anyone shopping for a Maverick right now, it is that the hybrid is not just a marketing gimmick or a box to check for buyers who want to feel good about fuel economy. Over 100,000 real miles, with real fill-ups and real maintenance receipts, the numbers speak for themselves. The system held up mechanically, the battery showed no signs of decline, and the fuel savings alone justified the choice several times over. If you drive mostly in stop and go traffic or short trips around town, this powertrain is going to reward you every single time you fill up. If you are doing pure highway commuting at a steady 70 miles per hour every day, the gap narrows, and it is worth running your own numbers before deciding. But for the vast majority of truck buyers doing a mix of errands, commuting, and the occasional weekend project hauling, the hybrid Maverick earned every bit of its reputation, and then some. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next real-world ownership update. And drop a comment letting me know what you want to see covered next, whether that is a deeper dive into the battery replacement costs down the road, how the hybrid handles towing, or a side-by-side comparison with the standard EcoBoost model. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.